Island, Part 11. They teach, the Rani hesitated. They teach special techniques. What sort of techniques? Will inquired. But she couldn't bring herself to go into the repulsive particulars, and anyhow it wasn't necessary, for Murrigan, bless his heart, had refused to listen to them. Lessons in immorality from someone old enough to be his mother. The very idea of it had made him sick. No wonder. He had been brought up to reverence the ideal of purity, brahmacharya, if you know what that means. Quite, said Will. And this is another reason why his illness was such a blessing in disguise, such a real godsend. I don't think I could have brought him up that way in Parlour. There are too many bad influences here, forces working against purity, against the family, even against mother love. Will pricked up his ears. Did they even reform mothers? She nodded. You just can't imagine how far things have gone here. But Kuthumi knew what kind of dangers we would have to run in Parlour. So what happens? My baby falls ill, and the doctors order us to Switzerland, out of harm's way. How was it, Will asked, that Kuthumi let you go off on your crusade? Didn't he foresee what would happen to Murugan as soon as your back was turned? He foresaw everything, said the Rani. The temptations, the resistance, the massed assault by all the powers of evil, and then at the very last moment the rescue. For a long time, she explained, Murugan didn't tell me what was happening, but after 3 months the assaults of the powers of evil were too much for him. He dropped hints, but I was too completely absorbed in my master's business to be able to take them. Finally, he wrote me a letter in which it was all spelled out, in detail. I cancelled my last 4 lectures in Brazil and flew home as fast as the jets would carry me. A week later we were back in Switzerland, just my baby and I, alone with the master. She closed her eyes and an expression of gloating ecstasy appeared upon her face. Will looked away in distaste. This self-canonized world saviour, this clutching and devouring mother, had she ever, for a single moment, seen herself as others saw her? Did she have any idea of what she had done, what she was still doing, to her poor silly little son? To the first question the answer was certainly no. About the second one could only speculate. Perhaps she honestly didn't know what she'd made of the boy, but perhaps on the other hand she did know, knew and preferred what was happening with the Colonel to what might happen if the boy's education were taken in hand by a woman. The woman might supplant her, the Colonel, she knew, would not. Murugan told me that he intended to reform these so-called reforms. I can only pray, said the Rani in a tone that reminded Will of his grandfather, the Archdeacon, that he'll be given the strength and wisdom to do it. And what do you think of his other projects? Will asked. Oil, industries, an army? Economics and politics aren't exactly my strong point, she answered with a little laugh which was meant to remind him that he was talking to someone who had taken the 4th initiation. Ask Bahu what he thinks. I have no right to offer an opinion, said the ambassador. I'm an outsider, the representative of a foreign power. Oh, not so very foreign, said the Rani. Not in your eyes, ma'am, and not, as you know very well, in mine, but in the eyes of the Palanese government, yes, completely foreign. But that, said Will, doesn't prevent you from having opinions. It only prevents you from having the locally orthodox opinions. And incidentally, he added, I'm not here in my professional capacity. You're not being interviewed, Mr. Ambassador. All this is strictly off the record. Strictly off the record, then, and strictly as myself, and not as an official personage, I believe that our young friend is perfectly right. Which implies, of course, that you believe the policy of the Palanese government to be perfectly wrong. Perfectly wrong, said Mr. Bahu, and the bony, emphatic mask of Savonarola positively twinkled with his Voltairian smile. Perfectly wrong because all too perfectly right. Right, said the Rani protested. Right? Perfectly right, he explained, because so perfectly designed to make every man, woman and child on this enchanting island as perfectly free and happy as it's possible to be. But with a false happiness, the Rani cried, a freedom that's only for the lower self. I bow, said the ambassador, duly bowing. to your highness superior insight. But still, high or low, true or false, happiness is happiness and freedom is most enjoyable, and there can be no doubt that the policies inaugurated by the original reformers and developed over the years have been admirably well adapted to achieving these two goals. But you feel, said Will, that these are undesirable goals? On the contrary, everybody desires them, but unfortunately they're out of context. They've become completely irrelevant to the present situation of the world in general and Parlour in particular. Are they more irrelevant now than Are they more irrelevant now than they were when the reformers first started to work for happiness and freedom? The ambassador nodded. In those days, Parlour was still completely off the map. The idea of turning it into an oasis of freedom and happiness made sense. So long as it remains out of touch with the rest of the world, an ideal society can be a viable society. Parlour was completely viable, I'd say, until about 1905. Then, in less than a single generation, the world completely changed. Movies, cars, airplanes, radio, mass production, mass slaughter, mass communication, and above all plain mass. More and more people in bigger and bigger slums or suburbs. By 1930, any clear-sighted observer could have seen that, for 3/4 of the human race, freedom and happiness were almost out of the question. Today, 30 years later, they're completely out of the question. And meanwhile, the outside world has been closing in on this little island of freedom and happiness, closing in steadily and inexorably, coming nearer and nearer. What was once a viable ideal is now no longer viable. So Parlour will have to be changed. Is that your conclusion? Mr. Bahu nodded, radically. Root and branch, said the Rani, with a prophet's sadistic gusto. And for two cogent reasons, Mr. Bahu went on. First, because it simply is impossible for Parlour to go on being different from the rest of the world, and second, because it isn't right that it should be different. Not right for people to be free and happy? Once again, the Rani said something inspirational about false happiness and the wrong kind of freedom. Mr. Bahu deferentially acknowledged her interruption, then turned back to Will. Not right, he insisted, flaunting your blessedness in the face of so much misery. It's sheer hubris. It's a deliberate affront to the rest of humanity. It's even a kind of affront to God. God, the Rani murmured voluptuously. God. Then, reopening her eyes, these people in Parlour, she added, they don't believe in God. They only believe in hypnotism and pantheism and free love. She emphasised the words with indignant disgust. So now, said Will, you're proposing to make them miserable in the hope that this will restore their faith in God. Well, that's one way of producing a conversion. Maybe it'll work, and maybe the end will justify the means. He shrugged his shoulders. But I do see, he added, that, good or bad, and regardless of what the Parlourese may feel about it, this thing is going to happen. One doesn't have to be much of a prophet to foretell that Murugan is going to succeed. He's riding the wave of the future, and the wave of the future is undoubtedly a wave of crude petroleum. Talking of crudity and petroleum, he added, turning to the Rani, I understand that you're acquainted with my old friend, Joe Aldehyde. You know Lord Aldehyde? Well, so that's why my little voice was so insistent. Closing her eyes again, she smiled to herself and slowly nodded her head. Now I understand. Then in another tone, how is that dear man? She said. Still characteristically himself, Will assured her. And what a rare self. L'homme au cerf-volant, that's what I call him. The man with the kite? Will was puzzled. He does his work down here, she explained, but he holds a string in his hand, and at the other end of the string is a kite, and the kite is forever trying to go higher, higher, higher. Even while he's at work, he feels the constant pull from above, feels the spirit tugging insistently at the flesh. Think of it, a man of affairs, a great captain of industry, and yet for him, the only thing that really matters is the immortality of the soul. Light dawned. The woman had been talking about Joe Aldehyde's addiction to spiritualism. He thought of those weekly seances with Mrs. Harbottle, the automatist, with Mrs. Pym, whose control was a Kiowa Indian called Barbo, with Miss Touquet, and her floating trumpet out of which a squeaky whisper uttered oracular words that were taken down in shorthand by Joe's private secretary. Buy Australian cement. Don't be alarmed by the fall in breakfast foods. Unload 40% of your rubber shares and invest the money in IBM and Westinghouse. Did he ever tell you, Will asked, about that departed stockbroker who always knew what the market was going to do next week? Siddies, said the Rani indulgently. Just Siddies. What else can you expect? After all, he's only a beginner. And in this present life business is his karma. He was predestined to do what he's done, what he's doing, and what he's going to do. What he's going to do. She added impressively and paused in a listening pose, her finger lifted, her head cocked. What he's going to do, that's what my little voice is saying. Includes some great and wonderful things here in Parlour. What a spiritual way of saying, this is what I want to happen, not as I will, but as God wills, and, by a happy coincidence, God's will and mine are always identical, Will chuckled inwardly, but kept the straightest of faces. Did your little voice say anything about Southeast Asia Petroleum? He asked. The Rani listened again, then nodded, distinctly. But Colonel Dipper, I gather, doesn't say anything but standards of California. Incidentally, Will went on, why does Parlour have to worry about the Colonel's taste in oil companies? My government, said Mr. Bahu sonorously, is thinking in terms of a 5-year plan for inter-island economic coordination and cooperation. Does inter-island coordination and cooperation mean that Standard has to be granted a monopoly? Only if Standard's terms were more advantageous than those of its competitors. In other words, said the Rani, only if there's nobody who will pay us more. Before you came, Will told her, I was discussing the subject with Murrigan. Southeast Asia Petroleum, I said, will give Parlour whatever Standard gives Rundown, plus a little more. 15% more? Let's say 10. Make it 12.5. Will looked at her admiringly. For someone who had taken the 4th initiation, she was doing pretty well. Joe Aldous will scream with agony, he said, but in the end, I feel certain you'll get your 12.5. It would certainly be a most attractive proposition, said Mr. Bahu. The only trouble is that the Palanese government won't accept it. The Palanese government, said the Rani, will soon be changing its policy. You think so? I know it, the Rani answered, in a tone that made it quite clear that the information had come straight from the master's mouth. When the change of policy comes, would it help, Will asked, if Colonel Dipper were to put in a good word for Southeast Asia Petroleum? Undoubtedly. Will turned to Mr. Bahu. And would you be prepared, Mr. Ambassador, to put in a good word with Colonel Dipper? In polysyllables, as though he were addressing a plenary session of some international organisation, Mr. Bahu hedged diplomatically. On the one hand, yes, but on the other hand, no. From one point of view, white, but from a different angle, distinctly black. Will listened in polite silence. Behind the mask of Savonarola, behind the aristocratic monocle, behind the ambassadorial verbiage he could see and hear, the Levantine broker in quest of his commission, the petty official cadging for a gratuity, and for enthusiastic sponsorship of Southeast Asia Petroleum, how much had the royal initiate been promised? Something, he was prepared to bet, pretty substantial. Not for herself, of course, no, for the crusade of the spirit, needless to say, for the greater glory of Kutumi. Mr. Bahu reached the peroration of his speech to the international organisation. It must therefore be understood, he was saying, that any positive action on my part must remain contingent upon circumstances as, when and if these circumstances arise. Do I make myself clear? Perfectly, Will assured him. And now, he went on with deliberately indecent frankness, let me explain my position in this matter. All I'm interested in is money. £2,000 without having to do a hand's turn of work. A year of freedom just for helping Joe Aldous to get his hands on Parlour. Lord Aldous, said the Rani, is remarkably generous. Remarkably, Will agreed, considering how little I can do in this matter. Needless to say, he'd be still more generous to anyone who could be of greater help. And I'll stop there.